Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the QUT Faculty of Law for today's conference on intellectual property and education in the age of COVID. As is always the case, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, and in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where QUT now stands and recognise that these have always been places of teaching and learning, and we wish to pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. And in the context of debates around intellectual property and education, there has been very significant discussion about the importance of Indigenous intellectual property. Today's event is going to look at some of the relationships and connections and intersections between intellectual property and education. It will cover many different species of intellectual property, spanning copyright law, trademark law, patent law, trade secrets, and questions of licensing. In many ways, the conference today is also going to span an array of different disciplines within education, everything from the creative industries to medicine and biotechnology and even clean technology. In addition, this event is also going to focus upon open licensing within the educational institutions. So the use of open licensing to promote open access, open innovation and open data is also a very kind of important dimension in terms of the debate and discussion over intellectual property and education. This event is also going to focus upon the role of universities and educational institutions and research organisations in responding to the coronavirus COVID-19 public health crisis. So universities and research institutions have a very particular special role to play as keystones in the knowledge infrastructure. They are generating a whole wide range of technologies that could be of use in tackling the coronavirus crisis, including vaccines, treatments and diagnostics, as well as a range of other public policy solutions. So this event, amongst other things, is going to think about ways and means in which we can encourage public transfer of some of those research and public policy solutions. Finally, this event is also going to be an Australian launch for this research handbook on intellectual property and technology transfer, edited by Professor Jacob Rooksbury from Gonzaga Law School. This collection provides a comparative analysis of how an array of different countries manage intellectual property and technology transfer from educational institutions, and also kind of includes a contribution by myself looking at intellectual property and higher education and 3D printing. So welcome everyone. I hope you enjoy today's range of presentations looking at different aspects of intellectual property and education. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, my presentation is going to be on the people's vaccine, intellectual property, access to essential medicines, and the coronavirus. And this presentation builds upon some of my past research over the past couple of decades. So for a very long time, I've been doing work on patent law and access to essential medicines, and have investigated in the past some of the patent races in relation to HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria, some of the issues around access to drugs related to neglected diseases. There's also been a significant array of conflicts over intellectual property and cancer drugs. More recently, there has been issues around intellectual property and emerging infectious diseases. So back in 2004, I did a paper on the race to patent the SARS virus, but I've subsequently also looked at avian influenza and Ebola. In that context, the coronavirus public health crisis raises both some classic issues in relation to intellectual property, as well as some novelties in terms of some of the issues that we face. But to begin with, a little bit of history, particularly in the 1980s, there was a lot of controversy over intellectual property and access to essential medicines, particularly with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. This came to a head in the late 1990s with 39 of the world's largest pharmaceutical drug companies suing Nelson Mandela's government over accessing generic antiretroviral drugs. Such was the backlash against their pharmaceutical drug companies that in the end those companies withdrew the action, and there were a number of international acknowledgements of the ability of nation states to make use of flexibilities under intellectual property law to address public health epidemics. So the Doha Declaration in 2001 recognised the ability of nation states to make use of a whole wide range of intellectual property flexibilities under the TRIPS agreement in the World Trade Organisation to deal with public health emergencies. Those flexibilities include compulsory licensing, patent pools, public sector licensing, as well as a range of other kind of strategies. In 2003, there was the WTO General Council decision, and that set in place a system to allow for the export of pharmaceutical drugs to those developing countries that lacked local manufacturing capacity to develop drugs. Unfortunately, though, those international declarations did not necessarily resolve some of the conflicts taking place in relation to intellectual property and access to medicines. So UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon convened a special high-level committee led by Ruth Dreyfus to discuss ways and means of better promoting access to essential medicines. Former High Court Judge, the Honourable Michael Kirby, was involved in this committee. This committee made a number of recommendations to try to ameliorate some of the problems in relation to access to essential medicines. With the breakout of the coronavirus in 2019-2020, these issues have come to the fore again, but in a slightly new context. And there's been a lot of debate about ways and means of encouraging international cooperation to take action in relation to the development and deployment of COVID technologies. So in my presentation today, I'm going to kind of provide an overview of some of these flexibilities, including the people's vaccine. I'm going to look at the ACT Accelerator that was set up by the World Health Organization, the Coronavirus Technology Access Pool established by Costa Rica and the World Health Organization, the expansion of the role of the Medicines Patent Pool, the use of compulsory licensing, public sector licensing, the establishment of the Open COVID Pledge, a patent pledge not to kind of take infringement action, and also action in relation to open science. To begin with, there has been a lot of concern about the prospect of vaccine nationalism breaking out in relation to research efforts in respect of the coronavirus. So the Trump administration has scorned multilateral efforts to set in place a kind of a cooperative effort to develop vaccines and treatments and diagnostics, and has instead gone down its own path of trying to develop its own vaccines under what is known as Operation Warpspeed. And there's been a lot of concern about the ethics and morality of such an approach of putting America first, of trying to look after the concerns of one nation with a vaccine plan before distributing those vaccines more widely to the rest of the world. It hasn't only been the United States that has been of concern. There has also been a lot of concern about some other superpowers, such as China and Russia, also kind of engaging in vaccine nationalism. There's also been a lot of concern about some nation states engaging in cyber hacking of vaccine efforts around the world. In addition to the concerns about vaccine nationalism, there's also been a kind of concern about the operation of capitalism in relation to the distribution of drugs, medicines, vaccines and diagnostics. Over the past couple of decades, there's been a lot of concern about pharmaceutical drug companies, biotechnology developers, medical diagnostics companies relying upon patents and other secondary forms of intellectual property to gain a strong control over new medicines and charge exorbitant prices in relation to those products. And at this moment, a number of the drug companies have said that they are still going to approach vaccine development and treatment development on a profit basis. A couple of the big pharmaceutical companies have said, you know, they might just go on a cost recovery basis, but there's certainly been a big concern about monopolies being created in relation to key vaccines to deal with the coronavirus. So in response, there's been a great public campaign led by Oxfam and UNAIDS to push for a people's vaccine. They have contended that governments and international partners must unite around a global guarantee which ensures that when a safe and effective vaccine is developed, it is produced rapidly at scale and made available for all people in all countries free of charge. And they have also called for a similar approach to other treatments, diagnostics and technologies related to COVID-19. Winnie Byanyima has been a key figure in the push for a people's vaccine as the head of UNAIDS. Winnie was very kind of concerned about the impact of the AIDS epidemic upon her home country and other nation states in Africa. She was one of the voices behind Ban Ki-moon's commission to try to push for solutions in relation to access to medicines. She has pushed very hard for there to be a people's vaccine. And she's also found a very worthwhile ally in the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark. Together, they have expanded upon the necessity for a people's vaccine. The pair have maintained granting one company exclusive rights to the science, know-how and intellectual property of a coronavirus vaccine will prevent us from getting the billions of doses that the world needs. They have argued this extraordinary moment calls for a better approach than our current regime of monopoly rights. And they also suggest that aside from insisting on the sharing of knowledge and intellectual property, which countries should be urgently financing the rapid expansion of safe manufacturing capacity in developing countries. They published an open letter, and that open letter was supported by a wide range of world leaders, both past and present. So Imran Khan, the leader of Pakistan, for instance, supported the open letter in relation to a people's vaccine. Some past leaders as well, like Gordon Brown, the former leader of the United Kingdom, but an array of other health advocates, economists, elders like Mary Robinson, economists like Joseph Stiglitz have also supported the establishment of a people's vaccine. I guess a kind of a key question is how that model will be realised. And there have been an array of different institutional models that have been put forward to try to deal with the question of how to encourage research and development and deployment of vaccines, but also to ensure that other treatments and diagnostics are offered and for those things to be made available on an accessible and equitable basis. The World Health Organization has invested a lot of its energies in establishing the ACT Accelerator. ACT is shorthand for Access to COVID Tools. The ACT Accelerator was launched on the 24th of April 2020 by the Director General of the World Health Organization, the President of France, the President of the European Commission, the Gates Foundation and various other governments, health organisations and philanthropists. The ACT Accelerator has several key pillars. They essentially are looking for a total investment of $31.3 billion in this new institution. The pillars include vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics and a health systems connector. The vaccines program is going to be run by CEPI and Gavi, and they're seeking $18.1 billion for the next 18 months. The therapeutics will be controlled by UNAIDS and the Wellcome Trust. They're seeking $7.2 billion for the next 12 months. The diagnostics will be managed by FIND and the Global Fund, and they're seeking $6 billion for the next 12 months. Quite an elaborate structure has been put into place in quite a short period of time. I guess there's been quite a bit of debate about whether this model is appropriate, whether it's well designed, whether or not it has kind of support from some of the key stakeholders. Some civil society organisations like MSF have been a little bit concerned about lack of consultation with non-government organisations, but they also question whether Gavi have the experience to really lead the vaccines pillar. For his part, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said that public health is a classic global public good, and that there is a kind of a need to support this initiative. With the United States under the Trump administration scorning the World Health Organization, the European Union has really been playing a key role in pushing for the ACT Accelerator and trying to get pledges of money to support that initiative. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel in particular has kind of emphasised that a world free of COVID requires the most massive public health effort in history, and she has kind of emphasised that there's a need to share data, resources to try to tackle the coronavirus. So it's been striking that she's provided very kind of public support for the initiative, as has Emmanuel Macron. A number of mid-tier countries have also been kind of quite vocal. So Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has kind of called for an equitable approach to the distribution of COVID technologies, and he's written a couple of letters along with other world leaders talking about such principles. Jacinda Ardern has also joined in such calls. Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison, for his part, has kind of talked about the need for a safe and accessible vaccine. In terms of some of the other approaches, Costa Rica has argued that there should be a technology access pool to share key COVID technologies. So even though Costa Rica is quite a small nation, it's been a great policy innovator in this space, and they have put forward a proposal to have some sort of clearinghouse in terms of key technologies. This has been taken up by the World Health Organization under Dr. Tedros. It will be interesting to see how that mechanism operates in practice and how it works alongside the ACT Accelerator. The leader of Costa Rica and the head of the World Health Organization have said that it will play kind of a key role in ensuring that research is affordable, available and accessible to to everyone around the world. It should be stressed that participation in that scheme is on a voluntary basis. That scheme has also been supported by Professor Brooke Baker and an array of other champions in relation to access to essential medicines. The medicines patent pool was set up a decade ago to really provide greater access to medicines in relation to HIV/AIDS. The medicines patent pool has said that it will play a constructive role alongside CTAP into trying to make key technologies subject to patent protection accessible and available. And Mary Porkini has expanded the jurisdiction temporarily of the medicines patent pool to facilitate that situation. There remains a lot of discussion about what to do in those circumstances in which pharmaceutical drug companies or nation states refuse to provide access to key patent technologies or only make access available at quite high, expensive rates. A number of nation states have said that they will rely upon compulsory licensing mechanisms that will compel patent holders to provide access to medicines in return for some compensation. Helen from the Netherlands and France has been focusing upon some of these policy responses. Joseph Stiglitz has said that there's a need to revisit the WTO General Council decision because in the current pandemic it's become clear that nation states that are developed might need to seek imports quite rapidly or exports from other countries. And MSS Access Campaign have also been pushing for there to be urgent steps taken to define how COVID-19 medical tools can really be global public goods. And the South Centre has also provided some advice in that space. This event is on intellectual property and education, and the question of public sector licensing is very important in that context. What should happen to those technologies that have been developed with public funds? The Universities Allied for Essential Medicines have been arguing that universities and research institutions should make those technologies available in an accessible and affordable form, relying upon public licensing. They have campaigned that we should free the vaccine. The Stanford University Office of Technology Licensing has set up a framework to enable universities and research institutions to help share their technologies. And in parliaments around the world, there have been politicians and legislators calling for publicly funded research to be explicitly made affordable and accessible. Just to wrap up, I'd also just want to highlight a couple of other options. The Open COVID Pledge has been a really interesting initiative in which companies and research institutions have made a pledge that they won't sue for patent infringement or other IP infringement in relation to research in respect of the coronavirus. Professor George Contreras has been a great champion of that, and the Creative Commons movement and the Electronic Frontier Foundation have supported that initiative. The New Jersey Institute of Technology has taken such a pledge in relation to some of its 3D printing technology, but some of the big IT companies like IBM and HP Enterprises have taken that pledge. But really, also, the COVID crisis has highlighted the importance of open science initiatives. So some Canadian researchers in particular have been looking at the law, policy and ethics of COVID-19. And Jeremy De Beer and Richard E. Gold from the University of Ottawa and McGill University respectively have said that the pandemic highlights the need for open cooperative approaches to science to allow larger international networks to be put into place to tackle this great public health challenge. In conclusion, Professor Myra Tafik has written a really interesting piece of late highlighting how the coronavirus has really sparked a push for intellectual property law reform. And she says that the crisis has meant that we need to think harder about how to have a better balance within the intellectual property system, particularly dealing with access to essential medicines. But she's also kind of emphasised that we really need to rethink the way in which the intellectual property regime operates to better promote collaboration between researchers and scientists, particularly to deal with global health challenges and some of the larger sustainable development goals. Thank you very much.